Title: He chose his mother. I chose divorce. Story: I thought my husband was just a mama's boy, until I found out that he and his mother were planning to erase me from my own life. Now, I'm trapped in a suburban nightmare with a target on my back and no one to trust but myself. I stood in the center of our living room, the space that used to feel like a sanctuary, now reduced to a sterile stage for my undoing. My suitcase sat by the door, a pathetic, leather-bound testament to 5 years of emotional erosion. Mark was standing in the kitchen, his back to me, clutching his phone as if it were a life raft. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't even yelling. He was doing that thing he did whenever his mother called. He was shrinking, turning into a shadow of the man I had married. When we first met, I thought his closeness to his mother, Evelyn, was charming. I admired a man who respected his family. I was a fool. It wasn't respect. It was an umbilical cord that had never been severed, and over time, I realized I was just a squatter in a life that belonged entirely to them. Every major decision, every holiday, every weekend, had to be filtered through the prism of what Evelyn deemed appropriate. She didn't just want to be involved, she wanted to be the architect of our reality. The final straw wasn't a secret affair or a grand betrayal. It was a Tuesday afternoon. We had been planning our first real vacation in 3 years, a week in Italy to celebrate our anniversary. We'd saved, we'd booked, we'd dreamt. Then Evelyn called. She had decided she was going to have a minor surgery, a routine gallbladder removal, on the exact week of our trip. She demanded Mark cancel everything to be at her bedside, not to help, but to provide emotional support while she recovered in her private villa. When I tried to protest, Mark looked at me with those tired, hollow eyes and said, "She's my mother, Elena. You're being selfish." That was the moment the fog cleared. I saw him for what he really was, a man who would always treat me as a secondary character in his mother's play. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just started packing. As the sound of his voice drifted from the kitchen, "Yes, Mom, I'll tell her we're staying," I felt a chilling sense of relief. I walked into the kitchen, his phone still pressed to his ear, his eyes wide and panicked as he realized I wasn't just venting, I was leaving. I reached over, gently plucked the phone from his grip, and set it on the granite counter. "I'm leaving, Mark," I said, my voice steady enough to terrify him. "And don't bother coming after me. I've already contacted a lawyer." His face went pale, a mixture of confusion and genuine terror, as if the concept of me having agency was a glitch in his universe. He turned back to the phone, his mother's voice chirping tinny, impatient questions from the speaker. He looked at me, then at the phone, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I grabbed my keys, but before I could take another step, he blocked the hallway, his expression shifting from shock to a cold, calculated mask I had never seen before. "You aren't leaving this house," he whispered, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on my arms stand up. "My mother has already handled the legal side of things, Elena. You don't think I'd be this reckless without her guidance, do you?" My breath hitched, catching in a throat suddenly gone dry. I looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing my husband's skin. The man who once apologized for leaving the toilet seat up was now standing in my path with the stillness of a predator. The air in the hallway felt heavy, pressurized, as if the walls themselves were closing in to trap me in this suburban nightmare. "The legal side?" I repeated, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it firm. "What are you talking about, Mark? We have a prenup, and everything else is in both our names. You can't handle me out of my own life." He tilted his head, a gesture he had picked up from Evelyn, and gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You really have no idea, do you? You've been so busy playing the victim that you never noticed the paperwork you signed last year. That refinancing document I brought home for the house? That power of attorney form I told you was just a formality for our medical insurance? You signed away your rights to the property, the savings, and even your autonomy, Elena. You aren't a partner in this marriage. You're a liability. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. I remembered that night, a frantic evening after a long shift at the hospital, Mark rushing me to sign papers because he said we were finally getting a better interest rate on our mortgage. I had trusted him. I had trusted the man who swore he loved me. I took a step back, my hand flying to my bag, searching for my phone, but my pocket was empty. I looked at the kitchen counter. The phone was gone. "Give me my phone, Mark," I demanded, trying to inject authority into the command. He didn't move. Instead, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small black device, a jammer. He clicked a button and I watched the bars on my smartwatch vanish, replaced by the dreaded "no service" icon. Outside, the driveway lights flickered on, illuminating the silhouette of a black sedan pulling into our path. It wasn't his car. It was Evelyn's. "She's coming inside now to discuss your future, Elena," Mark said, his voice dropping into a terrifying, syrupy calm. "You chose this divorce, but you don't seem to understand that in this family, we don't allow for loose ends. You aren't leaving this house because, legally speaking, you aren't the one who owns the roof over your head. I suggest you sit down and wait for her. If you make a scene, well, Evelyn has never liked drama, and she's brought people who are very good at keeping things quiet." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm of pure, unadulterated fear. I backed away, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, retreating toward the back door that led to the garage. But as I reached for the handle, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the porch. Not Evelyn's delicate steps, but something heavier, more deliberate. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers shaking, desperate to escape before the front door swung open. Then, the deadbolt on the back door clicked shut from the outside. I was locked in, and through the glass of the kitchen window, I saw two men in dark suits stepping out of the sedan, their faces obscured by the shadows of the porch light. Mark stepped toward me, closing the distance with terrifying speed, his hands reaching out to grab my shoulders. "It's time to talk about your temporary mental health leave, darling," he whispered into my ear. "It's going to be a long night." The cold weight of his hands on my shoulders acted like a jolt of electricity. I shoved him with everything I had, the adrenaline of survival overriding the paralyzing fear. Mark stumbled back, his heel catching on the edge of the area rug, and he went down with a surprised grunt. I didn't wait for him to recover. I bolted for the utility closet, grabbing the heavy cast-iron fire poker hanging by the hearth, a decorative piece I'd always hated, now the only thing standing between me and whatever fate Evelyn had designed for me. The front door groaned open. A wave of expensive, cloying perfume, the scent of gardenias and manipulation, floated into the foyer before she did. Evelyn entered, her posture as rigid as a steel rod, her eyes scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a butcher inspecting a carcass. Behind her, the two men in dark suits stepped inside, their presence instantly transforming our home into a cell. "Elena, dear," Evelyn's voice was like velvet over razor blades. "You've always been so prone to these little outbursts. It's exhausting, truly. I told Mark that a woman of your disposition needed a firm hand, but he insisted on romance. Look where that got us." Mark scrambled to his feet, dusting himself off, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. "She tried to hit me, Mother. She's completely unhinged." "I see that," Evelyn replied, not even glancing at her son. She turned her gaze to me, her eyes narrowing. "The legal papers you signed were very clear. In the event of a documented mental health crisis, you relinquish all autonomy to your spouse. And judging by your behavior tonight, holding a weapon, screaming, fleeing your own home, I'd say we have more than enough documentation for the doctors arriving shortly." I swung the poker toward the door, my knuckles white, my entire body trembling. "I'm not crazy, Evelyn, and I'm not signing anything else. You think you can just erase me? I've already sent copies of those refinanced documents to a colleague at the DA's office. I knew the moment you asked me to sign them that something was wrong. I'm a surgeon, not an idiot." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. For the first time, a flicker of genuine doubt crossed Evelyn's face. She looked at the two men, then back at me. I hadn't actually sent the documents to the DA. I'd sent them to a cloud server no one knew about, but the bluff seemed to land. Mark's face went white. "She's lying," Mark hissed, though his voice wavered. "She wouldn't have known how to—" "Quiet, Mark," Evelyn snapped, her composure fracturing. She signaled to the men. "Take the phone from her and get the sedative. We have to expedite this." The men stepped forward in unison, their movements practiced and clinical. I retreated, backing into the kitchen, my heel catching on the island. I looked for an exit, but the only way out was past them. My eyes darted to the window above the sink. It was locked, but if I could break the glass, I could jump to the deck. As the first man reached for me, I swung the poker, not at him, but at the light fixture above the kitchen island. The glass shattered in a violent explosion of sparks, plunging the room into darkness. In the chaos, I heard a sharp cry, a man's voice, and the thud of someone hitting the floor. I scrambled across the counter, glass digging into my palms, and clawed at the window latch. I felt a hand grab my ankle, dragging me backward. I kicked out wildly, my boot connecting with a nose, hearing a sickening crunch. I hauled myself onto the windowsill, my legs dangling out into the cool night air. I felt the grip on my ankle tighten again, and then a familiar, chilling click echoed in the darkness. It was the sound of a gun being drawn. "One more movement, Elena," Mark's voice whispered from the dark right behind my ear. "And you won't need a divorce. You'll need a funeral." I froze, my body suspended between the safety of the dark yard and the nightmare of the kitchen. Mark's breath was hot and ragged against my neck, his hand trembling on my calf. The metallic scent of the barrel pressed against the back of my head was unmistakable, a cold, hard circle of reality that silenced the scream rising in my chest. "Step down, Elena," he hissed, his voice cracking with a terrifying mix of desperation and malice. "Don't make me do this. I don't want to hurt you, but Mother says the estate has to stay intact. You're just a temporary hurdle." "A hurdle?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. "You're talking about murder over money, Mark. You've lost your mind." "I'm talking about legacy." Evelyn's voice cut through the dark, cold and clinical from the foyer. "Mark, stop playing with her and finish it. The ambulance will be here in 10 minutes to transport her to the facility. It needs to look like a tragic accident during a manic episode. A fall from a height, perhaps? Or a struggle where the weapon accidentally went off?" My mind raced, every instinct honed by years of surgery shifting into survival mode. I wasn't just a victim. I was a surgeon. I knew anatomy. I knew how fragile the human body was, and I knew how to use that knowledge. I felt the pressure of the gun ease slightly as Mark shifted his weight to get a better grip. He was inexperienced, terrified, and relying entirely on his mother's instructions. He was the weak link. I didn't try to pull away. Instead, I went limp, letting my weight drop suddenly. It caught him off guard, his balance shifting as he lurched forward to compensate. In that split second, I lunged backward, slamming my elbow into his solar plexus with every ounce of strength I possessed. He gasped, the wind knocked out of him, and the gun clattered to the floor, not outside on the grass, but onto the kitchen tile. I didn't reach for the gun. I reached for the high-pressure spray hose attached to the industrial sink. I whipped the nozzle around and squeezed the trigger, blasting a freezing, high-velocity stream of water directly into his face. He howled, stumbling back, blinded and gasping. I scrambled through the open window, tumbling onto the wooden deck and hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud. I didn't wait to check for injuries. I sprinted toward the perimeter fence, the high, chain-link barrier that stood between me and the main road. "Get her!" I heard Evelyn shriek, her voice losing its icy composure and descending into a frantic, high-pitched rage. "If she reaches the street, we're finished. Kill her if you have to." Heavy boots thundered behind me, shaking the deck boards. I reached the fence, clawing at the wire, my fingers tearing on the sharp edges. I hoisted myself up, the adrenaline burning in my veins, ignoring the blood dripping from my hands. I threw one leg over, then the other, feeling a hand grab the heel of my shoe just as I dropped to the other side. The shoe stayed in his grasp. I tumbled onto the pavement of the road, skidding across the asphalt. I jumped to my feet, limping, and saw the headlights of a car turning onto the street. A patrol car, its blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I waved my arms, screaming for help, my lungs burning, my vision blurring with tears and exertion. But as the car pulled closer, my blood ran cold. The vehicle slowed, but it wasn't a police cruiser. The marking on the side wasn't the local precinct. It was a private security logo, the same company that supplied the men in the dark suits. As the window rolled down, I saw not a police officer, but the familiar, chilling face of Evelyn's private investigator. He looked at me, then up at the house, and keyed his radio. "Package is secured," he said calmly, looking me dead in the eye. "Bring the van around." The realization that there was no outside left to run to was like a bucket of ice water to the soul. The investigator didn't even draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply smiled, a thin, pitying expression, and nodded toward the house. Behind me, the back door burst open, and Mark emerged, face dripping, eyes wild and bloodshot. Behind him, Evelyn stood framed in the kitchen light, looking like the grand orchestrator of a symphony that was about to reach its final, dissonant crescendo. My heart was a frantic bird against my ribs. I looked at the dark street, then at the van pulling silently around the corner, its headlights cutting through the night like the eyes of a beast. I knew that once I was inside that van, I wouldn't be seen again. Or, if I was, it would be as a hollowed-out shell, a medical mystery they'd care for in some secluded facility until I was just a memory. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic hum beneath the sound of the idling van. It wasn't an engine. It was a drone, a high-end camera drone, buzzing low and frantic. I remembered the house across the street. An elderly, retired investigative journalist lived there, a man who spent his nights obsessively monitoring the neighborhood security feeds. I didn't run away. I ran toward the van, forcing the investigator to step out. As he moved to intercept me, I didn't try to fight him. I threw myself onto the pavement directly beneath the hovering drone's camera, pulling my phone from my pocket, the one they hadn't realized I'd managed to keep during the struggle. I held it up, screen glowing, and started the live stream I had hit go on the moment I climbed the fence. "My name is Elena Thorne," I screamed, my voice cracking, but loud enough to catch the attention of the neighborhood. "I am being held against my will by Mark and Evelyn Thorne. If I disappear, this video is already on a public server. The police are being alerted right now." The investigator froze, his hand hovering over his radio. He looked up at the drone, then back at the house. Evelyn's face, visible from the porch, drained of all color. She knew that in this age, a digital footprint was a ghost that could never be exorcised. She had built her power on secrecy, and I had just set the house on fire. The sound of sirens began to bleed into the night, not the private security variety, but the screeching, multi-tone wail of real authorities. Someone had been watching. Someone had been listening. Mark reached the fence, his bravado shattered, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't even climb over. He looked at me, then at the flashing lights approaching from the main road, and the mask finally crumbled. He didn't look like a predator. He looked like a small, pathetic boy. He sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands, finally accepting that his mother's world, and his role as her golden puppet, was over. Evelyn retreated into the shadows of the kitchen, but there was nowhere to go. I watched as the first patrol car skidded to a halt, the officers pouring out with weapons drawn, their lights turning the lawn into a surreal, strobing stage. I stood there, shoeless, bruised, and covered in grit,
as the officers swarmed the property. They didn't go for me. They moved past me, straight for the front door. I watched as they dragged the men in suits out in cuffs. I watched as they entered the house, and a moment later, I saw them escorting Evelyn out. She was no longer the queen of her domain. She was a woman in a silk robe, being read her rights, her face twisted in a silent, impotent fury, as the cameras of the neighbors caught every humiliating detail. Mark was led past me in handcuffs. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. He looked at the house, then at his mother, realizing for the first time that his choice had cost him everything. Not just me, but his future, his reputation, and the very foundation he had traded his soul to protect. I sat on the cold curb, waiting for the medic to hand me a blanket. The divorce wouldn't just be a legal filing anymore. It was a liberation. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in colors I finally felt like I could see again, I realized the irony. He had chosen his mother, and in doing so, he had chosen to lose the only person who actually knew who he was. I had chosen my life. And as the last of the police cars pulled away, I took a deep, steadying breath. It was over. I was finally, truly alone. And for the first time in 5 years, that was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. Image prompts. 1. A cinematic close-up of a terrified woman looking over her shoulder inside a dimly lit, luxurious suburban kitchen, with a sinister, shadowy figure blurred in the background. High tension, thriller movie aesthetic, dramatic lighting, 8K resolution. 2. A wide shot of a woman running away from a dark, modern house at night. Glowing blue police sirens reflecting on the wet pavement. Dramatic silhouettes, high contrast, cinematic film still, intense atmosphere. 3. A portrait of a manipulative older woman in a silk robe standing in a brightly lit, sterile kitchen foyer, her expression cold and calculating. Cinematic depth of field, sharp focus, luxury home interior, dark mood. 4. A split-screen concept showing a woman clutching her phone while live streaming in the dark on one side, and a man in handcuffs being led away by police on the other. Gritty realism, cinematic color grading, high drama. 5. A tense, low-angle shot from the perspective of a victim cornered by 2 men in dark suits inside a lavish house. Flickering light fixture overhead, shattered glass on the floor. Cinematic thriller lighting, photorealistic.